My name is Chris Punongbayan, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of California ChangeLawyers, and I'm very excited to be moderating this program today. The mission of California ChangeLawyers is to build a better justice system for all Californians. Our program today is called The Fight for Freedom, and it's about the story of Frankie Carrillo. In 1991, he was convicted for killing someone in a drive-by shooting in Los Angeles based on flawed eyewitness testimony. It took 20 years for Frankie to be exonerated. Today, we will hear from a distinguished panel of speakers, including Frankie, lawyers from both sides, as well as the judge who oversaw the case. Frankie's story is so powerful because it exposes the deep injustices in our system of criminal prosecution. And at the same time, Frankie's resilience and ability to remain hopeful is a lesson for all of us. His story was recently featured in the Netflix documentary, The Innocence Files. So just really quickly about the format today, I'll be asking each of our panelists one question. Then we will have one round of questions, or we'll open it up to questions for the rest of the panel to answer as they will. And then at about 12:45, we'll have questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please drop it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please note that this conversation is being recorded. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Frankie. Frankie Carrillo grew up in Linwood, California. At the age of 16, he was arrested, tried, and convicted as an adult for a crime he did not commit. It took nearly 15 years for him to get the attention of a lawyer who believed him and believed in him. On March 16, 2011, Frankie was exonerated. Since his release, he's graduated from Loyola Marymount University. He sued the Sheriff's Department and won. He's married and raising a family in Echo Park in Los Angeles. He has become a leading voice in criminal justice reform. Frankie, it's so great to see you and to have you here. Your story was one of the features in a Netflix documentary. How does it feel to have a documentary made about your life?
First of all, Chris, thank you for having me and my friends with me on this amazing Zoom presentation about my story. To your question, it's, you never know until it happens what the impact is going to be, what the response will be from friends, family, neighbors, people from around the world. But I'm very happy that the response has been very positive. You kind of leave you get interviewed and you leave all the editing to someone else to do. You believe that the director and editor and producers will make you look, put you in the best light. So I'm very happy with the way it turned out.
Oh, very good. You never know how those things are going to go.
Exactly.
Tell us, how was it that you were able to make it through all those years incarcerated? How did you maintain your faith in the system that the truth would eventually come to light?
Well, like you pointed out, Chris, I was a boy when this happened. I didn't have really any or nothing at all of life experiences that can guide me in this experience that was really about adults. This is a form that was even for some adults they have trouble with. But I think when you're a child trying to maneuver all these experiences while you're coming of age and so on is very difficult. But moving forward after the wrongful conviction and I was incarcerated, I think the part about keeping hope, I really was banking on the fact that while I knew one, that was a mistake, but two, I just knew that that there would be someone out there who would look at this and believe me, first of all, but second of all, understand that the process makes mistakes. And at the time, this happened in 1991. And, sadly, back then, there was no innocence projects. And the idea was that everyone says they're innocent, so that doesn't help someone who's actually innocent. But of course, family, friends, and this belief that the system could correct itself, and it finally did.
Thank you for that. We're going to shift now to Paige Kaneb. Paige is a supervising attorney and assistant clinical professor who has worked at Northern California Innocence Project since 2007. In that time, she has helped free 12 of NCIP's clients, including Frankie. Paige maintains her own caseload, supervises NCIP students, and has publications on actual innocence as a constitutional claim and wrongful convictions related to wrongful diagnoses of shaken baby syndrome. So Paige, welcome. It's great to have you. The Innocence Project did years of work to reinvestigate this case. Can you describe what that process was? And did you know that your work would ultimately lead to exoneration?
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so our investigation, we sort of thought of it as two avenues, one into the real perpetrators and one into the eyewitnesses. So we wanted to nail down everyone who was in the car. We had known already who had fired the shots because that evidence had come out around the time of Frankie's sentencing, but hadn't been fully explored. But we had that on our side and these handwritten confession notes. And there were roadblocks, a lot of roadblocks on both avenues. You had these real perpetrators who were free, who had families, who were, not inclined to put themselves into a life sentence, especially they'd let Frankie basically rot for something they had done all of this time. And for the eyewitnesses, they felt like they had done right by Damien's father. They had come to believe that Frankie was the person who'd shot Damien's father and killed him. And so they weren't inclined initially to talk to us, and in fact wouldn't until Damien said that it was okay to tell the truth. And that was I started this case right out of law school. I learned a ton from our team, and especially Ellen, about keeping pushing and keeping going back. And we managed to talk to all the people around the perpetrators to figure out, get evidence about who all of them were, and kept coming back to Damien until he was ready to talk, and also to tell us that it was okay to talk to everyone else, to tell them that it was okay. And then it was like dominoes falling. Damien said, I couldn't really see anything, sort of a big black blob. You couldn't see a face at all, no features. We had scientific evidence that that's all you could see given the level of light. And then as we talked to each of the eyewitnesses, they all said basically the same thing. And then there was one we couldn't find, and the DA's office actually found him, and he said the very same thing to them, but I'll let Juan talk about that more. But in terms of whether I believed this was going to lead to investigation to an exoneration, as I said, I was right out of law school. I absolutely believed. I mean, for me, there was no other way that it could possibly turn out. We had proof about who had really done it. We had taken apart all of the evidence that it was Frankie, as each person said. I didn't actually see him, and so I know part of this was naivete on my part, but I never imagined that it wouldn't work out.
Thank you. And if you haven't yet seen the documentary, I highly recommend it. It's episodes 4 and 5. So Paige started to allude to some of the specifics that were in the case. So please watch that after this. Our next speaker that I'd like to introduce is Juan Mejia. Juan is a 25-year veteran prosecutor with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Over the course of his legal career, Juan has worked in various assignments, including central felony trials, Eastlake juvenile, major narcotics, and habeas corpus litigation. His notable trials include the 1995 retrial of Eric and Lyle Menendez, where he served as a member of the prosecution team. Juan was awarded Loyola Law School's St. Ignatius Award for his work on Frankies Case. And in 2016, he was honored by his colleagues as Prosecutor of the Year for his work in post-conviction litigation. So Juan, great to have you with us. Your office originally prosecuted this case. Can you give us a little bit behind the scenes look at what it was like in the DA's office when you found out what the Innocence Project was up to?
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I was part of the habeas corpus litigation team at the time that Frankie's attorneys had presented their case to our office. They did a very smart thing. Frankie's lead attorney, Ellen Eggers, and the Northern California Innocence Project, they contacted and reached out to an attorney in our office named Bill Hodgman. Bill Hodgman was an assistant district attorney. He was like third in line in terms of the bosses, and they had made a contact through a neighbor of Bill's, law professor named Scott Wood, who made an introduction because Ellen said, we need to get someone in the DA's office to talk about this case and get our foot in the door. At the time, we didn't have a conviction review unit, a unit that reviews cases of possible innocence. We just had a habeas corpus unit, which dealt with all kinds of post-conviction case matters, including claims of innocence. Anyways, they did this presentation, a PowerPoint to Bill. Bill was very impressed by the presentation. I think it was still kind of in the initial stages of what they were doing in their investigation. They had, I think, 4 of the 6 witnesses had recanted, and they had some information about the notes and other things. And Bill then brought it to Hablet, the habeas corpus team, and the deputy in charge, who's Brentford Ferreira, who appears also in the documentary, and eventually became my co-prosecutor on the case when we did the habeas case. He assigned the case to me, and later, a few months later, the defense made a similar presentation to me and my investigator. They were very upfront. They put all the cards on the table. They didn't hide the ball like some defense attorneys might. And they were hoping that maybe we would just be convinced at that point and agree on a petition to free Frankie. Now, while I had an open mind, I was also very skeptical because you hear, as Frankie says, everyone says they're innocent. And we used to get these petitions all the time about they were wrongly convicted or my lawyer didn't do a good job. So, and what I had to keep in mind is that, at one point or another, 6 eyewitnesses in a trial said that Frankie was the shooter, and a jury found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And witnesses recant, and it happens for many reasons. Sometimes it's because attorneys or investigators for the defense put it in the witnesses' heads that they made a mistake maybe 20 years ago, and or maybe they get pressure from some other group, a gang or something. So we had to do our own investigation, and it was when we did our own investigation, we did find another recanting witness, and then one of the witnesses who still stuck to his guns about what he saw eventually recanted at an evidentiary hearing. So that's what was going on in the office when we were first presented the case of Frankie Carrillo.
We'll get into more follow-up in the next round, but first let's make sure we hear from Judge Paul Bacigalupo. And just a reminder for all of our attendees, if you have questions, please do drop them in the Q&A box. And if you haven't already, put in the chat if you're so inclined where you're from and what your name is. So Judge Paul Bacigalupo has been a judge in the Los Angeles Superior Court for 17 years and has held criminal and civil trial assignments in Compton and Van Nuys. He's the immediate past president of the California Judges Association, the founding chair of the Latino Judges Association's Judicial Applicant Support Committee, a former member of the Judicial Council of California, and is an appointed special master with the Commission on Judicial Performance. Before coming to the bench, Judge Bacigalupo practiced civil law throughout California and was a private mediator and arbitrator. Judge Bacigalupo, what was your impression of this case when it came before you back in 2011?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, ChangeLawyers, for this fireside chat. It's a privilege and it's an honor to be with this panel because they're outstanding lawyers, and Frankie Carrillo's an extraordinary person who I have had the pleasure of getting to know. I had a criminal trial assignment in Compton for 12 to 13 years, and I had scores and scores of habeas petitions, a lot of them. And the vast majority of those petitions are filed by self-represented litigants. And they're put together, generally handwritten, pieces of paper coming from this, from that, maybe some trial transcript. Maybe something's taken out of a probation report. Maybe there's another piece of paper coming from here, handwritten, typed, and the law is wrong. The facts are wrong. The issues are all over the place. It's a self-represented individual. He's fighting for his life. He's looking for someone to hear about his case, hoping that the court finds some error in something that happened. And I look at those and I give them the respect that they're due to try and sift through all of that mess, but yet see where is the issue really, where was there a mistake, was there something that formed the basis of somebody not getting a fair trial. Well, when I saw the petition in this case, that wasn't the kind of presentation of evidence that came before the court. It was so impressive to see the petition that was filed, how comprehensive and thorough the defense team, and it really is a team that I saw. It was members from the Northern California Innocence Project, and a whole score of members, including Paige. And Ellen Eggers, another defense lawyer, and also a pro bono firm, Morrison and Forster, that got involved. There were so many people involved and investigators. You know, the law that they presented and the briefs were just extraordinary. And then the package of exhibits and declarations, there was a lot of material, a lot, very thorough. Then when that's filed, the district attorney's office, on behalf of the government, files a return. And they likewise submitted a very thorough and comprehensive opposition to the petition. So when I see this, with all these claims of disputed facts, I realize and recognize we have to have a hearing on this case. We have to sort this out. And so we set a briefing schedule, and it was a long hearing. I think it was about 3 weeks in length. There were a lot of witnesses that came in and testified. And these are individuals who are now having to come into court and once again testify after previously testifying one way, then filing declarations under penalty of perjury, maybe saying something different, then recanting, going back and forth, and it's sorting through all this. And so I think what I saw then was, because to your question of what was my impression of this, I realized that this was a really, really important case because it was about finding what's the truth. And I saw that there were a lot of people interested in that. I saw that there were high-level individuals from the sheriff's department, commanders, who were attending the hearing every single day to observe and find out what's going on in this case, because the consequences were quite severe, I think, as it would relate to what's the truth from this proceeding. There were a lot of spectators involved because it was an interesting case. Loyola Law School got involved in the case, and I think a lot of students from there came every single day to the hearing. And so there was a lot of interest. I had to have initially the issue of, should the proceeding be televised? And I agreed that it would be televised. And so that was another dimension of the case. And then finally on the day, the very first day when there was opening statements, for the very first time, when the custody door was opened in the courtroom, and out walks this gentleman wearing the county blue outfit. And I'm looking at this man, Frankie Carrillo, and I saw this individual with this, like a smile on his face. And people were looking at him, and he was smiling, and he was greeting people who he had known, his team that had been working on his case. And I thought, this isn't the kind of individual that I normally regularly see, the demeanor of somebody who's been in state prison, convicted of murder for over 20 years. It just didn't, it was different. It was entirely different. And so it was definitely a very unique case that I had before me.
Well, thank you, Judge, and to all of our panelists for just giving us more insight, because maybe like everyone else here, we saw the documentary and it opened up so many questions. And so really appreciate your taking the time in this first round. So the next round of questions are a little bit more open. So anyone who's interested in taking this first question. So at the time of the original trial, it was the early 90s in LA. And I think maybe the elephant in the room was just what was the role of race in the original trial. And so I'm wondering if any of you can opine about that. What did you feel was the role of race when the original trial happened?
I can jump in if no one else is going to. I think of race, especially in cases like Frankie's, as sort of an underlying factor that you can't point to it in any one place. There's no point where anyone said like, oh, because he's a Hispanic, that's why, or because he looks like a gang, or we think he's in a gang. I mean, the gang piece, definitely. I think that's one of the really main links, right? Is the way we see young people from poorer neighborhoods, especially young men of color from poorer neighborhoods. They can very easily sort of be tarred as a gangbanger, murderer. And then I think it does make it's just easier to arrest them. It's easier to charge them. It's easier to convict them. It's easier, as Frankie mentioned this in the documentary, like no one was going to believe that he was home on a Friday night, even though he was, right? But that's part of, had he, I actually think of Frankie as someone who does look like a prep school boy now. But had he, come off as like a rich white kid in high school, it would have been much easier to believe that he was home at 16 on a Friday night studying.
And Frankie, were you going to jump in?
I was just trying to unmute it, but absolutely. It's really a combination of the first trial and second trial. They were only maybe 6 months apart. But if I may, Chris, and it's moving into the second trial, but I think it's vital. The court system in Los Angeles, maybe the entire state, was halted because of the Rodney King riots. So there was a break in the city because of the riots and the fires and so on. And I recall my trial was supposed to begin during that time of the year. I think it was either March or April. And my trial resumed the day the courts reopened. And I always, and like Paige said, you can't really point to this as a violation of any civil rights here or really anything else. But what I thought was interesting was that, the city had just experienced a very racially motivated experience with the results of the trial against the officers who assaulted Rodney King. And so here's my first day selecting the jury, where the pool of jurors are hearing the facts of the case, where there's a young Latino male accused of killing an African American. And so that in the greater scheme of what was going on in the city was not working in my favor. And so I'm not sure how that ultimately played out in the jury's minds. I'm not sure anyone ever asked them. And more specifically, Chris, the sheriff's department in my case was, as it was pointed out in the documentary, there was a lot of issues in how they perform their duties. And I said it very clearly in the documentary that at some point it became very clear to me that they were not trying to play fair when it came to my case. And was that based on factors involving my family or status in the world or the color of my skin? I think to some degree it did have a role in all that.
Yeah, and thank you for highlighting the role that class plays as well in terms of how people are seen within the system. The combination of race and class, I think, is very powerful in determining the outcomes of certain cases. This is a question, again, for everyone. So in the documentary, it was revealed that there was a kind of a dramatic recreation of the scene of the crime. And I'm not a trial lawyer, and I'm not in the criminal process. It just seemed pretty unusual. Is that the case? And why and how did you all agree to that?
Can I take a stab at that?
Yes, please.
Very unusual. In jury trials, you do have juries go out to the crime scene sometimes to take a look, but not you don't bring a judge out 20 years later to try to do a reenactment. That just isn't usually done. And why did we agree to it? Because Ellen is a pain in the butt. She kept insisting that this was key to her case, and I didn't think so. I thought that this was a case of recanting witnesses and tainted identification, and that's all you needed. But she really wanted to do it. I will say, though, that when we did do it, it was pretty dramatic. I had already known how dark it was, because when I was doing my investigation and I went to interview Jeff Coleman, who was still living on the street, across the street from where this shooting took place, when the murder took place, we went out in October, and around 7:30, 8 o'clock, it was already dark, and I just stood there with my investigators, and I said, let's look at the cars go by, see if we can see. So we just couldn't see that well. And the murder that happened in Frankies Case happened in January, so it gets much darker much sooner. So if the shooting happened at 5 or 6 o'clock, it was already dark, and that was a dark street. So I already knew that was a factor. But bringing a judge out to a crime scene like that, I thought was very unusual. I never knew what impact that had on Judge Bacigalupo, because he never told us.
Well, I can tell you it is very unusual, highly unusual. It's the only time I've ever done it. And I've done hundreds of trials. Never done a reenactment like that. I've seen reenactments in the courtroom, but never out to the crime scene. And just by a crazy coincidence, the lighting from the moon and the weather and all of the climatic conditions based upon the information that NASA provides were nearly identical to the day in question that occurred years ago. And so that was presented to me. And indeed, Ellen Eggers was persistent in asking me day after day to go out and do this. And Juan was saying, no, we don't need to do it. And what did I have before me? I had witnesses telling me that they wrongly identified Frankie. And what was the basis for that? There were various reasons each of them were giving for why they did that. But a theme throughout that was, could they actually see who the perpetrator was? I mean, literally see. And the science about how our memory works when we do see an event or an individual, and the cross-racial identification, which is so important in an ID case. So I realized, I've got to go out and see this. I've got to see the reenactment. And so we did it. It was very emotional, highly charged. The lawyers were there. Members from the sheriff's department were there. Of course, they're interested, and they're sitting on the sidelines doing this. There's an issue of public safety. The Judicial Protection Services did not support my decision, but they did, of course, protect me going out to the scene. It was very, and I might add that it was traumatic, because it was also reliving, a crime scene that had happened years ago, and so that impacted deeply some of the people who were there in a traumatic way. So I'm glad they did it. I'm glad I was able to participate in that.
Thank you. If you have a question, please do drop it in the Q&A box. We already have a few, and we'll get to those in just the next section. But please do drop any questions in there. Judge Bacigalupo, let's stay on you really quickly again. Were you surprised when the DA's office agreed that the conviction should be set aside? And how often do you see cases like that?
I was surprised, and it doesn't happen. It rarely happens. Often the lawyers from the district attorney's office will put on a soft opposition. They'll submit on it, but they don't want to come out and say, yes, we agree. They want the judge to make the decision. And so it was courageous for Juan and his office and Brett Ferreira to make that public statement. They waited until the very end of the presentation of the closing argument to finally say that. I think it was a very suspenseful moment in the documentary when that happens. But it did surprise me because they put on a strong defense. They the burden of proof in a habeas case lies on the petitioner. It's not on the government. And so they required the defense team to put on its case and sustain its burden of proof. And I think they made the right decision, of course, to submit on that. And so I was surprised, but and it made my ultimate decision a little bit easier. After that happened, I took a pause. I went back into my chambers. I reflected on everything. And normally this is the kind of case that you take under submission, and then you spend a lot of time and you review your notes, you review the transcripts and the evidence, and you think about it, and you write out a decision, and then you deliver the decision. But in this instance, it made it a lot easier. I went back on the bench and I said, petition granted. And then later we dealt with the written decision. And so that wasn't the end of it, though. There was still another question, because would the government prosecute him again? Because what really habeas hearing finds that the petitioner, Frankie, did not get a fair trial. So the government has the right within 60 days to retry him. And on that day, the district attorney's office did not say, we are not going to do that. And so there was some suspense for another 30 days or so to decide whether or not they would proceed. But then ultimately they said no.
Thank you for that insight. And Juan, please, yes. Well, I just wanted to give you some backstory because I don't even think Frankie knows about this, or Paige, but we took a break at around 3 o'clock, and we went outside the courtroom out in the area where you could smoke, because Brentford was a smoker. And we were there with my head deputy, Irene Wakabayashi, in Brentford, and we were talking about what to do, because we had to do our closing argument. We had put the witnesses' feet to the fire. We cross-examined them, all the witnesses, up and down, with their prior testimony, with their inconsistencies, because we still felt we had to do our job, which was, Frankie's team, they had the burden of proof, unlike in a regular trial. And we needed to make sure that these witnesses were telling the truth. So we cross-examined them vigorously. And, but I was arguing with Brentford. I said, Judge Bacigalupo, we can't read him. He might just deny this petition. He's got such a great poker face. We have no idea. I go, let me close. Let me just tell the court that he's met his burden of proof. And Brentford is one of the most colorful guys you've ever met. And he used an expletive, told me to be quiet. And he did his closing argument, which you saw part of in the documentary, where he went through every single witness about, you can't believe this witness, you can't believe this witness, you can't believe this witness. But then when he came to Frankie's testimony and Scott Turner's testimony, and he said that if a jury had heard that, that would have changed the outcome. And he felt, as an officer of the court, he had an obligation to tell the court that they had met their burden of proof. It truly was one of the proudest moments of my career, and listening to a colleague stand up and do the right thing like that, because we could have done the easy thing and let Judge Bacigalupo make the decision, and he could have surprised us and denied the petition, and then Frankie would have had to start all over again or taken an appeal. And but I felt we did our job.
I mean, I'll admit, when I was watching it, I had to rewind it like 3 times and say, "What did he just say? I don't get it." So it really was unexpected. Juan, at the end of the second of the 2 episodes in the documentary, you issued an apology to Frankie on behalf of the people of California. How did that feel, and why is that significant?
Well, you know, I had never met Frankie throughout this, I don't know, 8 months or 10 months of investigation up to the evidentiary hearing. And I first laid eyes on Frankie when he came through those doors, as the judge said. And so I didn't know Frankie, he didn't know me. And, you know, I was taught early on in my career that there's certain things as a prosecutor that you have to do. And number one, it's do the right thing, try to get it right, convict the guilty, exonerate the innocent, and play by the rules. That's what we have to do as prosecutors. And when I have a criminal case, when I was a trial lawyer, it was the people of the state of California versus Frankie Carrillo. So in essence, the people of California are my clients. And a wrong was clearly done in the name of the people of California. And I wanted to be the first person to walk over to Frankie. I believe Frankie still had handcuffs on. And I walked over and I said, you know, on behalf of the people of the state of California, I want to say I'm sorry. And he shook my hand. And, you know, that was a very emotional moment for me. And I'm proud to say that since then, Frankie Carrillo is a dear friend.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Paige, I want to talk to you a little bit about a central feature of the episodes and obviously of the case. Eyewitness testimony was portrayed as a central feature. For those who didn't watch the documentary yet, can you talk to us about eyewitness testimony and why it can be so flawed?
Yeah. So first thing is how powerful it is. I mean, to see someone, especially a victim, point at someone in the courtroom and say, that's the person who shot at me, that's the person who killed my dad. That's really compelling to us as human beings, and it's really compelling to hear, and especially from witnesses who believe it, right? This is one of the features that you see in this film, is that the witnesses, when they were testifying that way, thought Frankie was the right person. So they're not lying. It comes through as very credible and as really powerful. And the flip side of that is how even when everything is done right, studies have shown it's like less than 50% accurate. So it's just so easy to get wrong, especially when there's a crime going on. If there's a gun, people tend to focus on a gun as opposed to a face. Our memories aren't perfect. They change, they're influenceable. And when you don't know the person, you only see them for a flash, and then you're given pictures, and to pick someone out of those pictures, the other human tendency is to pick someone who looks most like the person you saw, if the real person isn't in there. And that's something that happens frequently. And then if you think about how easy it is, like all these things can go wrong even when everything's done right. And then it's also so easy for things to go wrong in the process. And that's one of the things that was in Frankie's case, where you have officers giving information, suggesting that it's the person, those eyewitnesses then telling other eyewitnesses who to pick. I mean, there are just so many ways that eyewitnesses can make problems and just get it wrong. And then to think about how powerful that is in the courtroom, it's just
Is that, I think maybe Paige's signal weakened for a little bit, but I'm sure she'll pick it back up in just a minute. This is actually a great time for us to segue into our Q&A section. So thank you to those of you who have submitted questions. And this question is for everyone. So I am currently in high school, and I would like to work in criminal justice reform. Do you recommend doing that? And what are some things that I can do right now? So that's for anyone.
I guess I'll give it a shot. So she's he or she's in high school, you said?
Yes.
Okay. I think that that's what's important right now, no matter what your career path is going to be, is to focus on the fact that he or she all of us will eventually be selected to be on a jury. And I think that we need to start thinking about, hi Paige.
Hi guys, sorry I lost my internet.
Oh, no problem.
I think that young people need to focus on the importance of that moment when they are called on to be a juror on a jury, and to understand the significance and the importance of the moment where you will be taking information. And my suggestion is to do everything in your power to fight off your own biases, fight off prejudice that you might have, and really focus on the evidence that is being presented. And that's not just for someone in high school, but that's just for everyone who will be on a jury someday. And I hope this person goes to law school, because we need more great lawyers, so why not?
Thanks, Frankie. And Paige, in case you wanted to answer this one, there is someone who's in high school who's joining us today, and they asked if they should get involved in doing criminal justice reform work and how they should go about doing that. So if you want to answer that.
I would say absolutely, yes. There is very little I could think of that would be more rewarding than this work. I tell people all the time how lucky I am and how fortunate I feel that this is what I get to do. Just try to make the system better, fight for justice, search for truth, and get to know people like Frankie and Juan and Judge Bacigalupo in doing it. The end of my answer, which I'm guessing got cut off, was we have actually done some policy reform around eyewitness identification. And so in California now, the person giving the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is. So what happened in Frankie's case, or doesn't know anything about the case. So what happened in Frankie's case shouldn't happen today in California. And, it's amazing to get to help individuals. It's so rewarding, but also changing things on a systematic level so things like this don't happen anymore is also just an incredible thing to do. So I would absolutely recommend going to law school, getting involved in policy reform, whether you become a lawyer or not. And I think all of us working together to make the system better. As Frankie said, it makes mistakes, and it's a system designed by and run by humans. And so we're all fallible and we're all capable of making mistakes, and looking at it from that angle and trying to improve it is just a great thing to be a part of.
Thank you. And I think we'll stick on this topic because you already alluded to it. So I'll ask this question next from Christina Mora. She's graduating from Berkeley Law. She says, thanks for hosting this event and to all the participants. Frankie's story highlights the needs for reform in this area. 20 years are too many when you are innocent. I was wondering if each of you could speak to potential ideas of reform to prevent these injustices from happening. So Paige, you mentioned one. Is there anything else? And for anyone else on the panel?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of ideas. My office has, we had some pending bills this year that were cut because of COVID, but one of the big ones is forensic science reform. We haven't done nearly enough to bring our laws up to date on forensics, either on the front end before trials or post-conviction. What do you do when science changes? But we've also been we've had the last couple of years, we have a policy liaison at the Northern California Innocence Project, and we've had a lot of successful bills in this area, like recording of confessions, best practices around eyewitness identification procedures, compensation for exonerees. So we're really trying to work on this, and would love to collaborate in any way with the recent law grads.
Excellent, thank you. Frankie, is there anything you'd want to add on this?
Yeah, it's something that Judge Bacigalupo alluded to. I've had a chance to obviously be a defendant inside of a courtroom, but I've also been to courtrooms since I've been home now, just to experience the proceedings. And what I've noticed over and over is that there are these trials going on with an empty audience. There might be some family members, possibly, maybe the victim's family might also be there. But I think that the community, for those who have time or can make time to maybe sit through a jury or sit through a proceeding to understand what it looks like with your own eyes. Maybe it's not reform, but it's definitely, I think it gives the proceedings a level that someone's paying attention or someone's watching, not necessarily to be sort of watching with those, through some, people screaming at the judge. It's more about just being able to understand how it works. Paige and I have worked in Sacramento to legislate for bills that I'm really happy passed, and the laws are being reformed, and loopholes are being closed and so on. But there's just so many ideas that people can come up with, and that's just one of many. But I think it's critical.
And Frankie has been amazing as an expert witness in getting some of these reforms passed.
I think that a lot of district attorney offices, like Los Angeles County, has created these conviction review units, which take a look at cases when there's these type of petitions that are filed, and take a look again at possible innocence cases. And our office has had this unit, the CRU unit, up and running for several years now, but I'd say it's 4 years or 5 years. And they've actually gone back and exonerated several people, and it's good work. I think there needs to be more funding for those kind of units. I think that counties would be smart to do that, because in the long run, if they don't do this type of work, they're going to get sued eventually. And so I think that our job is to do justice, whether it's at the time of a trial, or even if it takes 20 years, we need to do justice. I think in terms of another reform on the defense side, I think one of the things that's suspicious a lot of times as a prosecutor is you get these petitions and you get these declarations or reports from defense investigators, and they're just handwritten. California law requires that two people have to consent to recordings. There are exceptions for law enforcement, but they're not exceptions for defense investigators, for attorneys. And that might be something to look at, because I think if you have a video or an audio recording of someone's interview, you can kind of get a better idea of whether they're being pressured or not into making a statement, as opposed to just a handwritten report or a signed statement. I think that we were always kind of suspicious about that. Why couldn't they just record it? But that's the law in California. You can't record it. So I would advocate for that. And I think that there should also possibly, the state should look at funding more lawyers for indigent prisoners because right now, the way the law is, or the way the system is, a lot of these prisoners have to write their own petitions, and they scribble something on a petition, and it's really hard to understand, and they don't know the law, they don't know the procedure, and they screw themselves up, because sometimes they file multiple habeas petitions, and you're really only allowed to do one, maybe two, and then you have new evidence. But if you have like 8 of them, that's just an automatic reason to deny the petition, because you should have done it the first time. So maybe the state should think about funding more attorneys to do this type of work.
And this is a follow-up for you, Juan. You already started to allude to it. A question from Adrian. She asks how Frankies Case and Proven Innocence changed how you approach similar cases, and how are the lessons from Frankies Case being shared amongst other DAs in your office?
Well, I think every time there's a case like Frankie's, it's a lesson for everyone to learn about mistakes that were done in the past. I think that I had always tried to approach my job with an open mind. Early on as a trial deputy, I think I've been a lawyer for 4 years, maybe 5 years, I was doing a murder case, a shooting that took place in South Central, where a young girl witnessed her dad get shot. And she was standing near him, and she identified a juvenile. I think he was 17 years old at the time. He was going to be tried as an adult as the shooter. And I went out there at night, and with my investigator, stood where she stood and had the investigator stand where the shooter was. And I told him to point the gun at me. And I said, there's no way. They're too far, too dark, can't prove it. And we dismissed the case. And the easy thing would have been to just try the case and let the jury decide. But what if the guy was innocent? What if it wasn't him? And so we have to always try to do the right thing. And that's what I've always tried to instill in my young lawyers in my office is that it's not us versus them. It's not black and white all the time. There's a lot of gray sometimes. You got to look at the person on the other side of the table as a human being and not forget that. Yet we also have our mission as prosecutors to protect the public. Public safety is number one. We have to advocate for victims. And so it's a dual thing. You can do two things at once. And you don't need to look at the defendant as a monster or anything. It's a human being. And most of the time we get it right, I think. But there are times when mistakes are made, and tragically, like in Franky's case, it took 20 years to correct.
Thank you for that. And we have one more question. So this is last call for questions, if you haven't already submitted through the Q&A box. So our last question that's waiting is, I am already a lawyer, not in law school anymore. Paige, this is probably coming to you. What is the best way to pursue this type of work? I couldn't even find a pro bono opportunity in the LA area unless you are still in law school.
Ooh, so I'm not sure specifically about Los Angeles. I know a lot of us do use pro bono lawyers and partner with pro bono lawyers. And I think just reaching out to all the Innocence projects, I know we have some, like on our website, ncip.org, we have some volunteer opportunities. But I think just connecting with Innocence projects, and then also if you want to do, as Juan was saying, there are so many unrepresented inmates, and as Judge Bacigalupo is explaining, for them to file their own habeas petitions, and especially ones that are compelling and make it easy for the court to figure out what's going on, it's really hard. And so there's a huge gap in resources, and this is another policy change that I think would be amazing. So offering yourself to Innocence projects, offering yourself to inmates and or people who are out but are living under wrongful convictions, just get involved any way you can. I started as a volunteer at NCIP, and now just can't imagine doing anything else.
Thank you for that. So Franky, yes, Judge.
Let me just comment that get involved with the courts. You can, have that perspective of seeing the whole playing field of what happens. And the courts have self-help centers where we are constantly providing services for individuals who need assistance. You can have a clerkship with the judge and have a behind-the-scenes experience firsthand to see what happens, with papers that are filed and hearings that take place. And so always consider that as well.
Thank you. Franky, please close us out. Tell us what you're working on now and what you see for criminal justice reform in the future, and anything else you'd like to share with our audience today.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, fellow panelists here. Everyone did a great job. I think most foremost what I'm doing with my life now is being a ray of hope. There are a lot of people and families, it's not just individuals, but the families involved here who are looking for justice for those who are wrongfully convicted and are needing a story to motivate them. My story, all of these stories are very complex. Mine, as we've learned through the documentary and we're learning more about today, really, in my eyes, looked like a modern day miracle, where things that weren't supposed to happen are happening or did happen. and hearts were changed and minds were opened, and here I am living a free life because of it. But I think you know, give myself a little bit of credit here, is to have to endure wrongful conviction is very difficult when the system that you've been raised to believe in, and that system is really adulthood. You know, you look to adults to do the right thing. When that has shattered, you're left with questioning what your entire belief system. And so so one is hoping that my story can empower people, not only those who are in a prison cell, but also agents of justice who can do something, as everyone here has done their part. I've been home now for 9 years, so a lot of the work that I'm doing involves, hi Paige, involves you know, reform, mainly in California, legislative reform. There's a lot of things that I can take away from my case that has already been implemented. So as Paige mentioned, there are now safeguards for the photographic lineup procedures, other cases involving compensation here in California, a case that Juan alluded to about being filmed if you're a juvenile during your interrogation, which is very important. So I'm very proud to be part of that. You know, what's been sort of the cherry on top has been this documentary. You know, it allows me to bring in other people who are part of this story to, you know, to get the dues that they respect, that they're not only that they're owed, but they should be accredited and admired for their work, I suppose. And so it brings me a lot of joy that this is just not my story. This is our story. And folks who believe in justice and believe in the truth, it's your story as well. Finally, as to what I'm doing with my life now, more specifically, you know, I've always, maybe not always, but I'm definitely interested in politics. You know, I'm always looking for ways to give back and to help. And so I'm leaving those doors open for a possible run at public office. I'm really involved in mental health. So that's another area that I'm focusing on right now. That involve not only formerly incarcerated or wrongfully convicted, but just as a societal help seems to be more holistic for me.
Frankie, Juan, Paige, Judge Bacigalupo, thank you so much for joining us for this incredible conversation today. We really appreciate your time and just giving us a behind the scenes. So if you haven't watched the documentary, please do so. It's called The Innocence Files on Netflix, episodes 4 and 5. And then on Thursday, ChangeLawyers will be hosting another webinar on managing your finances in COVID-19. And then next Thursday, we'll be doing a session on imposter syndrome. So please join us for all of those. And again, a virtual round of applause for all of our panelists today. Thank you.